Welcome back to We Play Games. I'm Walker, and here we are in CK3 after the end, about to discuss our next lore video, Águila o Sol. So this is going to be our lore video focused here inside of Mexico, but for those of you who haven't watched any of the other lore videos, in these videos I like to discuss a little bit of the geography and the history and the cultures here within this region in the real world, so that way we have some idea of what we're actually seeing in-game. Because I think that the mod team does a very good job of taking things from the real world and translating them, and understanding what you're looking at is a little easier if you know the backstory. So before we jump in on the geography and the history, I think let's just have a brief conversation about Águila o Sol itself. This means in Spanish, eagle or sun, and it's sort of just the phrase for heads or tails in Mexico, but more important than that, it's also one of these things that highlights the transitory and conflictory nature of the Mexican state. So for those of you who don't know, Mexico is like one of the largest countries here inside of North America with an enormous population, including an enormous population of indigenous peoples. So indigenous peoples, they're very, very important when it comes to the reformation of these societies inside After the End, simply because they're going to have the social technologies necessary to survive in a post-apocalyptic scenario. But they're also really important inside of Mexican society. Benito Juarez, for instance, was himself an indigenous person and is generally considered one of the best presidents of Mexico, if not the best president of Mexico, due to his importance in throwing the French out when they tried to invade and install a Habsburg prince as the new emperor of Mexico. But the position of indigenous people inside Mexican society has always been complicated by the fact that, of course, Mexico was an imperial possession of Spain. The indigenous people had been conquered and been subjugated and exploited by the Spanish, and that meant that there was an inherent power imbalance, even if there was also an inherent population imbalance. Even now, there's somewhere between 12 and 20 million people of indigenous descent living inside of Mexico. And so this is a really interesting location in terms of highlighting what sort of societies could emerge in a post-event scenario inside of CK3 After the End, but also just a nice opportunity for us to discuss geography and the importance of geography on a society as it emerges in a post-apocalyptic scenario. But of course, the cleavages inside of Mexican society here in CK3 After the End are not defined simply by indigenous people versus European people, or for that matter, folk religions versus Catholic versus indigenous versus idiosyncratic. Rather, there are a lot of different cleavages that have emerged inside of Mexican society, which is why the game has highlighted this as being the new conflict territory. So that's a sort of borrow from the vanilla CK3 experience. We have the standoff, and the standoff is going to be the fill-in for the Iberian conflict. It's going to have phase progress, and it's going to play pretty similarly to the phase progress in Iberia in the vanilla game. But I think it's even more useful here simply because these cleavages are also along government lines. So you can see here inside of Mexico, there's this giant strip of hydrocratic. Hydrocratic governments focus on the distribution of water. The way this works in game is that you can actually modify your vassal contracts about water rights. This is critically important inside of some parts of the world, including not only Mexico, but of course in terms of California and access to the Colorado River, because these are areas that are enormously dry. There are some very interesting things when it comes to the Sonoran Desert, because they do have access to the Sierra Madre and access to some water in very specific seasons, but the Sonoran Desert is still the hottest desert in North America. The Chihuahuan Desert is the largest desert in North America, and although there are these really powerful, useful rivers here, the Rio Grande is a little different from like the Nile or the Niger River. They don't create the same sort of floodplains because they just don't flood as often, and as a consequence of that, these areas are very, very dry, very low in terms of their overall agricultural output. But that means in turn that the societies that are going to survive here in in CK3 After the End have to think about water a lot more. And so that's just like one of the things where geography has in turn informed the societies that are emerging here inside of this game. But I think the most interesting thing to me, at least, is just the history here in Texcoco. So for those of you who are familiar with Aztec society and history, or for that matter, Mexica society, because of course the Mexica people were only one of the members of the Triple Alliance that formed the Aztec Empire. The Lake Texcoco has now been drained and paved over and exists at the bottom of Ciudad de Mexico. But Ciudad de Mexico, Mexico City, is also built on top of Aztec ruins. It's built on top of Tenochtitlan. And out here, we also have the city of Texcoco itself, which was another one of the cities around this lake bed. This lake was really critical not only for the development of early societies prior to the arrival of the Spanish, but also just as a water source and location. And critically, in this area, although now there's a little bit debate as to whether it was actually Lake Texcoco itself or a little bit further to the south, but this is one of the areas where agriculture emerged in human society. So agriculture, the domestication of plants, is sort of like one of those next level technologies that really transforms your society, a la stirrups or gunpowder. It dramatically transforms the way that humans interact with their resources. And agriculture really did dramatically transform the way humans interacted with resources. And the domestication of corn and the proliferation of agriculture throughout North America started in a couple of different areas because they didn't have the link with the old world by the time that the Spanish arrived. It had been tens of thousands of years since the collapse of the land bridge out here. But agriculture still emerged in North America, and for that matter in South America, and this was one of the breadbaskets. This was one of the first areas in human history where agriculture and settled societies emerged. And the game kind of gives a nod to that. So here in CK3 After the End, they are still adding title history as things go on, but right now, one of the oldest states that's ever existed inside CK3 After the End post-event is the Estados Unidos of Mexico. Premier Jefe Miguel actually refounded the empire and then died in 2084, which means that he's actually going to be a character who's formed this empire even prior to the refounding of California, although this has not been filled in just yet. But that makes the state of Mexico older than Tawantinsuyu, it makes it older than Brazil, it makes it older than Holy Colombian Commonwealth, and I think that's actually flavorful because of the nature of the development of agriculture inside this society, inside this world. Of course, the agriculture is not simply defined by access to water, but also because of access to that trans-Mexican volcanic belt that's out here. I read a book when I was very young about the eruption of a volcano inside of Mexico. I can't remember the name of it, but it was an illustrated book and it was really, really good. And it just highlights the importance of volcanic soil when it comes to the development of agriculture, because volcanic soil is, of course, very fertile. It's going to add a lot of extra raw resources to the area. And so the way that agriculture emerges and evolves here in this land is going to be a little different than it would be out here without access to volcanism and with relative little access to water. So let's start talking about the history of Mexico, but we'll talk about it from the perspective of the things that are here within the game itself. So there are a lot of Mesoamerican heritage cultures here within the game, but one of the most interesting, I think, is the Purepecha. So for those of you who are familiar with the history of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, you'll probably know about the Aztec Empire. If you know a little more, you'll know that it was actually the Aztec Triple Alliance, and that it was an alliance between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, who actually overthrew the regional bad guys. There had been a lot of regional superpowers that had emerged around the Manx of Texcoco over the preceding 2,000 years, but the most recent one had just been overthrown by Itzcoyotl in Tenochtitlan and Nezahualcoyotl in Texcoco. And that Triple Alliance actually was very, very powerful, very effective at projecting power into pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, but they never were able to defeat the Purepecha people. This is also occasionally known by the Tarascan Empire, but the Tarascan name is an exonym, and so it's considered a little pejorative by the Purepecha people. So here in game, the CK3 modders looks like they know what they're doing because they go with Purépecha rather than Tarascan. But the Purépecha culture was actually really interesting, and one of the most interesting things about it, to me at least, was that they actually were good metallurgists. So we'll see if they adapt this moving forward. I would love to see some sort of metallurgy cultural tradition here, because we found archaeological objects from the Purépecha for not just silver and copper and gold, but also bronze working. Now, most of the bronze objects that we found from the Purépecha were mostly ritual objects rather than military objects, but you know, it's not hard to think, hey, if they're already using bronze for ritual objects, conceivably they could be using it for other things, or eventually could have used it for other things. And of course, metal is just one of those things that once you have access to it, it's going to dramatically transform your society the same way that agriculture does. It's just going to dramatically transform the way humans interact with their environments. And the Purépecha were successful actually on multiple accounts of defeating the Mexica people of Tenochtitlan when they came doing their flower war raids against the empire out here. And so I think it's neat that they're here in game. I think that's a nice little nod to their ability to resist not only the Mexica, but also just the forces that might have emerged post-event here in game. Many of the other cultures here inside of CK3 After the End are also going to have references to either the environment, because as I mentioned, some of the environment here is quite stark. It's not going to be as dry as the Atacama Desert, but still the Chihuahuan Desert is the largest desert and the Sonoran Desert is the hottest desert. And anytime you have like an appellation like that, it's going to transform the societies that are successful inside those areas. But the cultures themselves are not simply defined by the environment, but also the cultures that they're emerging out of. Death is one of those things that's perpetually interesting to humans, right? We try to make sense of it, we try to understand it, we try to access, the emotional capability to deal with it when a person close to us dies. And Dia de Muertos, that's something that's become so popular that now there's a Pixar movie about it, is one of those things that exists inside of Mexican society today. But death does not stop there when it comes to existence and importance inside of Mexican society. Rather, now there's Santísima Muerte, which is, depending on how you define a religion or versus a cult, it's the fastest growing religion inside of North America as of 2023, with dramatic transformations in terms of the religious landscape in terms of Mexico and in terms of Mexican diaspora populations inside of the United States. But Santísima Muerte is here in CK3 After the End. It looks like this non-apocalyptic death cult in contrast to Catholicism, which is just an apocalyptic death cult, full stop. The Church of Santísima Muerte, a death cult that worships this female representation of death and a very different interpretation of it as well. They talk a lot about justice and a lot about trying to appeal to the oppressed people of Mexico, because as I mentioned, there is a lot of cultural cleavages inside of Mexico, including class cleavages. And Santísima Muerte is spreading very, very quickly amongst lower class people inside of Mexico at the moment. And I think it makes a lot of sense that they would be important here in this post-event world. There are, of course, re-emergent indigenous faiths here in CK3 After the End, as well as religions that are sort of directly related to the PRI and to the revolution. So for those of you who are familiar with Mexican history, you'll know that Porfirio Diaz was the dictator of Mexico for a very, very, very long time, and then ultimately was thrown out by Madero and a coalition of warlords, and then Madero was assassinated, and then there was a long period of a Mexican civil war during the 19-teens. That's where we see characters like El Centauro, Pancho Villa, becoming important in terms of the cultural milieu as well as the politics. But ultimately, there was an end to the Mexican Revolution, and some characters, namely Calles and Orozco, and then later Cardenas, became really, really important political and military figures inside of Mexico. And these religions, especially the Adotorista and the Alienadorato, are sort of indirectly or directly referencing the PRI and the power of the state when it comes to Mexican history. But the big boy here in Mexico is Catholicism. Now, Catholicism here in Mexico has actually split into a couple of different branches. We have, of course, the esoteric fraternity of the Limpios and Cristo Rey. Cristo Rey is like a little closer to mainstream Catholicism. Specifically, this is so much closer to mainstream Catholicism that they don't even recognize the presence of the Conclavian Catholic Church. They continue to hold out hope that somewhere the Bishop of Rome exists, and that if they don't, that the power of the Catholic Church should actually be located in the Mexican Church, due to the Mexican Church nominally having primature over the other Catholic churches on the continent. The Limpios, conversely to the Cristo Rey, are a lot more folkloric. So Catholicism has always had this sort of like pseudo-paganism to it, where you worship saints, or rather you pray to saints to act as intercessories for you, to help you out with God. And this kind of just takes that to the next level, that this worships a pantheon of quasi-deities rather than simply just asking saints for intercessory on your behalf. And so it's, I think, a really interesting way for the game to represent that Catholicism can go in a lot of different directions in a post-apocalyptic world. Perhaps they're going to stick to representing the Our Lady Guadalupe, who's one of the most famous saints here inside of Mexico, up there with St. Jude. But the esoteric fraternity of the Limpios really just takes the neo-paganism concept of Catholicism to the next level. And then, of course, there's the hexagonal rite faith. So this is, I did play a little playthrough with the hexagonal rite, but these guys are guys who worship not just, saints and folk heroes as the Limpio do, but masked luchadors, right? This is the religion of El Santo, of the Blue Demon. And so they represent not only the importance of religion in this society, but also the importance of folk heroes in this society. They represent sort of the aspirational aspect of folk heroism in a religious sense. The hexagonal rite has sort of their own mythos when it comes to the development of their own religion and the development of their society here in CK3 after the end, but they believed that at one point they moved down to Mexico City to retake it. I'm hoping it was in a really great wrestling match and they kicked the Arturistas out of there. There are also some fun little Easter eggs here inside of CK3 after the end, like the last dynasty here inside of the Mexican Empire, Paleo y Lagos. This is a reference to the Paleologos dynasty of Byzantium, or here this dynasty, Nezahualcoyotl. This is absolutely a direct reference to the ruler of Texcoco during the foundation of the Aztec Triple Alliance. But I think that this is just a really great bookmark if you're looking for just a way to explore this world that they've built here in CK3 after the end, because you get to see a really, really broad variety of religions, of cultures, and then of course you do also have access to the conflict. The conflict of the struggle here, I think, is a lot of fun. For those of you who haven't played the struggle in CK3 after the end, I recommend it very strongly. It does still have the same sort of choices that you have in the vanilla CK3 experience, but that means that you get to choose if you're playing here in Mexico. Águila o Sol. Is this going to be an empire that is going to be refounded and reemerge onto the world stage, soaring above it as a unified giant eagle, or flying down to Lake Texcoco and eating a rattlesnake on a cactus? Or are you going to go with the soul and allow lots of different people to flourish here inside of Mexico? All right, that's Walker here with Águila o Sol in our CK3 After the End lore series. Take care.